Hey there, everybody. I wanted to thank you all for joining us today on this, what's quite cold in Toronto. Looking forward to hopefully a little bit of a warmer April ahead. But thank you all for joining us today. I uh, I'm I'm Fraser with the marketing team here at Boosted AI, here to introduce Jamie McCulloch, who is with the solutions consulting team here at Boosted. Jamie's been leading large organization implementations of AI strategies. And he's been a consultant at Accenture in the past and worked with BMO, so understands both sort of the intersection of finance and AI and how teams are really leveraging this technology to their advantage. Today, we're here to talk about moving beyond the power user. We're seeing individuals use it and starting to see more enterprise adoption and covering how investment teams are winning with AI. So without further ado, I'd love to pass it off to Jamie. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Fraser. And yeah, thank everyone for joining today. Really looking forward to kind of some of the content that we're going to be going through. As Fraser's kind of alluded to, my name's Jamie McCulloch. I've been with Boosted for 18 months now within our solution consulting team. Worked for and with kind of like a lot of different clients across kind of like the wealth asset management space, and also kind of like with startup and sort of mature hedge funds, basically helping kind of guide clients to value in AI and using our kind of boosted alpha platform. And what we wanted to talk through today was sort of starting to think about and starting to see the sort of strategic adoption of generative AI, and kind of how that's changing almost from sort of individual adoption to more kind of like firm-wide strategic initiatives. So we're going to be diving into a little bit of kind of some of the reasons that we think that's happening, some of the drivers of that, kind of what options are sort of available to firms as they start to think about their AI strategy and their Gen AI strategy, some of the benefits and some of the challenges of kind of doing that at scale. And then we'll sort of jump into the platform, the boosted alpha platform, and sort of show how we think about kind of like solving some of those sort of enterprise challenges, some of those enterprise problems, and really bringing value basically to our clients. So as I say, we're going to be walking through kind of what's driving adoption, this idea between kind of like buy or build, the approaches that firms are taking, kind of the types of approaches that we want firms to take. We'll then jump into a demo of the boosted alpha platform and how we kind of think about agentic AI, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So as we sort of go through, if you have questions, just sort of fire them into the chat and things, and we'll be able to get to those kind of at the end of the call. So where I kind of want to start with this is sort of around this kind of like what is driving kind of like this large scale adoption. And before we get into some of the four reasons here, I think there's kind of two things that we're sort of seeing as a sort of like shift in the way that firms are adopting. And I kind of alluded to it in the intro, but the first one of those is this idea of going from like individuals, individual employees and individuals at a company who are kind of tech forward. They saw the sort of launch of GPT and things like that, and are kind of finding ways to sort of incorporate generative AI into their workflows. And we're sort of seeing the shift now from that to kind of like this sort of larger scale adoption. Firms coming out with kind of this sort of wider strategies, and sort of understanding that they need to kind of like empower their employees and empower basically their teams to be using Gen AI and to find kind of real value. In my experience, what that looks like is kind of is going from these engagements where we're talking to the one or two people within a team, and actually moving out to these kind of broader sort of 20, 30, 40 person proof of concepts that actually span multiple different teams, in order to kind of like get an idea of really what's possible with this technology and understand sort of the different use cases. And I think that demand kind of comes in a sort of specific way. I think we saw it initially as kind of a demand for generative AI as a sort of technology. And I think that sort of shifted. And what we're seeing from clients is it shift. It's almost this requirement for like an agentic workflow. You'll have heard sort of those terms kind of around. And really what we mean when we talk about like an agentic workflow is clients are really demanding basically that there is kind of larger amounts of sort of integration and automation of sort of complex workflows and using agentic frameworks in order to sort of automate those workflows and then do them kind of over and over again on a consistent basis to really drive value and drive integration in their processes. And we see that, I think, in kind of a number of different ways through a number of different use cases that kind of vary, I guess, across sort of like the wealth, asset management, and then kind of hedge fund space. And we can sort of dive into some of those later on as we go into the demo and things. But in terms of this sort of shift from kind of individual to large scale adoption, it's pretty exciting for us. I think what it shows is almost like, especially in kind of the finance world, is people are starting to realize that this is technology they need. This is technology that like really does kind of give value, and that they need to start thinking about from a kind of enterprise capacity. And some of the reasons we see for that are around things like kind of like data complexity. So there's huge numbers of data sources out there. There seems to be being kind of alternative data sources being added all the time. Companies, when they come to us, one of the first questions they're asking is kind of like, what data integrations do you have? What access to sort of different data do you have? And when we kind of do the wider rollouts, we're looking at things from kind of like internal and external research, filings, access to kind of like earnings transcripts, press releases, investor presentations, even across kind of like news and then sort of like structured data. And it's just kind of, it's pretty overwhelming. There's sort of all sorts of data out there, and it's a huge amount for people to be on top of. And I think really what this technology kind of does, what generative AI is sort of helping doing is providing, I guess, at the firm level, this ability to kind of centralize that data and then distill it out in a way that is kind of digestible and also customizable, so that different teams can access that in different ways based on their workflows. So if someone is kind of more interested in sort of reading into sort of like earnings transcripts and investor presentations, they can get direct access to those and the specific information thereafter, be it sort of things like capital expenditures, whether they've beaten guidance, stuff like that from within those kind of transcripts and presentations. Where someone else might be more interested in looking across things like, I don't know, proxy statements and understanding kind of like executive compensation and tracking basically how firms are kind of thinking about that. I think the next thing we see is this sort of pressure, as I say, to do kind of like more with less. Cost pressures in the industry are meaning that companies kind of, they need to be able to do more with less or kind of the same amount. And it means they need to be able to empower their employees to be able to kind of work faster and achieve more in the same amount of time. And I guess as a kind of side piece to that, be able to focus on the things that are the most valuable to them in terms of driving kind of revenues and driving basically sort of AUMs and things like that, and the real sort of value add processes that Gen AI at the moment can't actually help with. And we see a lot of people talking, and we always kind of push the conversation towards automation of workflows and finding those things that are causing pain in kind of the sort of daily, weekly processes and helping to kind of automate those within a sort of agentic framework. I think the sort of the last two here around kind of competitive edge and FOMO, they almost sort of play into each other. I think with this sort of technology and with any kind of brand new technology, there's this idea around sort of like, what are my competitors doing? How are they leveraging this? If you hear something from someone and how they're kind of incorporating processes, it's like, oh, that sounds super interesting. Why aren't we doing that? Why aren't I doing that? And I think that does sort of lend into this idea of FOMO and this feeling of, why aren't we doing something? We should be doing something because our competitors are. And also providing kind of that concept of, if we don't act now, there's people who are going to be ahead of us and they're going to be kind of further along in their adoption of this technology and in their ability to kind of scale the processes around it. And I think, all of those are sort of been kind of driving it, as I say, this sort of large scale adoption. I think sort of the next thing I think this is super interesting. I think this is kind of like what are firms and we went out as a company and did like a survey and we surveyed over 1,000 kind of like young high net worth individuals to understand kind of their feelings on AI, what they expect from, for example, their advisors or kind of where they're investing their money. And the results are pretty interesting. I mean, what we're seeing is around 70% basically, or 70% of those high net worth individuals really are expecting their advisors to be using artificial intelligence. And there was another stat that was also suggested that actually a percentage of those would definitely consider moving if they found out that their advisor weren't looking to kind of adopt the technology and utilize generative AI within their workflows. And then I think at the almost at the employee kind of level and at the company level and at the team level, it's like we're seeing that kind of a lot of people are using it. We are seeing this adoption, and people are kind of utilizing it within their workflow. So, three times more employees using Gen AI than leaders know, and that comes out of a McKinsey report. It's kind of execs maybe aren't even aware of kind of the amount of usage that there actually is of this technology. And I think like when you have a sort of mandate of kind of clients are expecting you to use it, your employees are kind of already use it. There's this sort of pretty clear mandate to firms and at the top of companies to understand that this is a strategic initiative that we kind of have to start paying attention to. And I think that sort of talks back to kind of if people are planning to move from their advisors um, based on the fact that they're not adopting this technology, it's pretty clear. It's kind of like we need to sort of get on top of this, or we actually risk kind of losing revenue and losing AUM to companies that are pushing this as a sort of strategic agenda. So what I kind of wanted to go to now is almost we've talked to sort of what the kind of large scale adoption is being sort of driven by. Um, and now I kind of want to take a look at what some of the options are. Once it's sort of decided, it's kind of like, right, this is something we need to be paying attention to. This is something that we need to sort of see. What are kind of the options that are available to you? And I'm kind of going to start from sort of right to left here. And I think the most damaging thing in this scenario is actually just to do nothing. We sort of see it with certain clients and with certain prospects where it's kind of like they want to sort of see where the technology goes, and then they want to kind of make their decision months down the line. And I think even if sort of there's not this kind of like you haven't got this kind of idea of sort of a specifically defined use case in your mind, or you can't quite see how it sort of fits in. Um, Taking the choice to kind of do nothing about this, what it means is in sort of months down the line, when you do realize sort of what exactly you can kind of narrow in on and use it for, you are going to be behind competitors. People are adopting this fast, and they're adopting it right now. And what that means is from a sort of knowledge building perspective, is they're able to kind of understand how to draw value from these platforms, what is actually available to them and like possible on these platforms from a sort of customization perspective and from a kind of agentic workflow. And they're just building up that knowledge, which means they're going to be sort of months and months ahead. And I guess in this world, it's sort of like the months are actually a kind of a huge amount of time, and the technology is changing incredibly rapidly. So starting now versus sort of 6 months down the line really can make a huge difference to people's understanding of the technology and how they can utilize it. I think the next option is kind of around this sort of idea of building in-house and going away and sort of trying to create basically these agentic or these generative AI technologies in-house. And that does have, I think there's a level of benefit to it, and it's definitely better than not doing anything. But I think in terms of like the build, the kind of the key risks that we see are this sort of time to value. It does take a long time in order to build up these technologies. It is pretty expensive, and there's going to be a sort of a human cost and a tech cost that kind of goes into this. And on top of that, it doesn't really completely sort of remove the risk of failure. There's no There's nothing to say that sort of as you kind of attempt to do this and attempt to build in-house, that further down the line, actually, you're going to have run into certain problems and you've realized actually it's not quite possible. And you sort of need to revert back then to kind of what platforms are on offer for you. One of the things I sort of would say actually is if you do build in-house, there is this kind of this ability to create hyper customized workflows. Now, um, in terms of like customization, this is something that agentic platforms out there and generative AI platforms offer kind of a high level of customizability out the gate. It's just something I think is worth calling out that if it is built in-house, you can sort of customize immediately to the exact workflows that you're working in. And then it kind of comes to sort of buy, and this is where Boosted kind of comes in, and this is where like platforms like ours sort of come to value. What we sort of try, I guess, to remove from that build element is like we've done the kind of the building almost for you, and like other technologies as well. They kind of done the building for you, and they mean that basically you can focus on the adoption piece and focus basically on ensuring that users are getting value from the platform and are upskilling and learning how best to use the platform. Which I think is kind of super important. And I'll call this out actually in a couple of slides around kind of like the challenges and the benefits of sort of enterprise level kind of generative AI rollouts. But adoption is sort of a key part of that. And it's a key thing that is kind of like is almost like a hurdle to sort of get over and kind of to get through in terms of like training and sort of getting teams kind of onto platforms and deriving value. And it's something that it's something we think about sort of very closely in terms of our engagements and when we're kind of running through sort of these kind of initial POCs and kind of onboarding clients to make sure that they're totally comfortable that they are actually kind of getting value from the technology. So the first thing I want to do is sort of call out, I guess, some of the benefits of kind of deploying at scale, almost kind of like versus sort of individuals focusing on kind of their own adoption of these technologies. And I think my opinion, I think it's kind of funny when people are sort of using, I guess, things like GPT. I use it all the time. And it's like I think we all kind of live in a sort of slight silo of not totally knowing exactly what it's fully capable of. And we kind of all think that we're sort of in some ways experts of the technology that we're using because it's helping us in the specific way that we're using it. But one thing I sort of really want to call out about kind of deploying AI at scale is this ability to kind of get scaled and consistent outputs, but also be able to knowledge share. And for people to be able to kind of look across teams, understanding how other teams are using specific platforms and using the technology to get their own ideas in terms of like how they can then upskill and derive more value from the technology in order to kind of automate things within their processes. And this is something that when we kind of are running sort of big sort of POCs and things like that, we have a sort of focus on sort of knowledge sharing. And if there's kind of multiple teams involved, we like to bring people kind of back together and sort of have those conversations of, oh, what have you found valuable versus what they found valuable. And often there's this kind of cross-pollination of ideas that really sort of drives basically the kind of the overall intelligence of the firm and of the teams and kind of multiplies basically the benefit. I think there's a sort of, from a kind of scale and consistency perspective, there's a sort of like, I think there's a sort of fairly obvious benefit in terms of if one person is saving kind of like an hour a day, and then you start to scale that up to kind of 10, 15, 20 people, we can start to see the sort of enterprise value to that. And then I think the knowledge sharing is kind of the sort of the multiplier on top that kind of helps there. And I think both of those sort of feed in, and almost the result of that is this kind of like strategic advantage and operational efficiency. So what it means when you've scaled basically your value and you've scaled the processes that you're automating and the analysis that you're carrying out, you kind of get this strategic advantage and this increased operational efficiency across teams that really kind of amplifies the benefits, really sort of sets kind of firms up to be able to fully take advantage of the technology, upskill new users, and generally just sort of spread information across the firm, and drive kind of generative AI as a key force for kind of moving the firm forward. And I think we'd be remiss as well for not talking about a couple of the challenges. And I mentioned earlier kind of around this concept of sort of user adoption. I think a lot of people are still they're still in like a kind of almost like a testing phase, and trying to work out how best to adopt generative AI and like more specifically, I think agentic AI. And I think one of the challenges is there is a learning curve, and there is this kind of perception that the effort required may not yield to the consistent and kind of or sort of variable outputs. So I think that's a really like important problem, sorry, to sort of think about as you kind of do these sort of wider deployments. It's something we think about a lot in terms of how we can sort of upskill our users, not only to have them kind of utilizing agentic frameworks that we've built for them, but also to start to build out agents themselves and really sort of pull value from the platform in order to set up repeatable, like automated workflows that are driving real value and fully integrated into what they're doing. I think the second piece here is also very important. It's like this maintenance of kind of consistency and repeatability. Sort of single kind of large language models, they can sometimes produce almost like varying results from kind of different from sort of similar queries and things like that. And what you really want to be trying to create, and we see this again, we see this demand from clients all the time in terms of we need to be able to create a workflow that is repeatable, that we know is going to remain the same as we kind of run it over and over and over again, and is going to drive sort of consistent results, and sort of surface the information that is most important to us. And we want it, we need it to be repeatable. So we need to be able to run that on a cadence so that when I have a kind of a daily workflow, I don't actually have to worry about kind of setting that going on every morning. It's something that's kind of, it's set up for me and it's running automatically. And those two things, they're kind of tough problems to solve, and I think are sort of super important in terms of driving kind of a sort of firm-wide and getting firm-wide kind of access and usage of generative and agentic AI. And it's something that I think we should all sort of be looking for when we're thinking about how best to kind of approach the strategy there. And I think one other thing, and I'll sort of talk to this in the demo as well, is almost like the scalability. In order to carry out specific like investment specific workflows, there's a huge amount of data out there, and we do need to be able to read all of it in order to make sure that we're confident that we're not missing things and that we are actually having the full amount of data kind of integrating into our agentic workflows. And so I'd really sort of harp on those kind of three things where we want to kind of maintain consistency. We want to make sure there's sort of this repeatability. And then we need to make sure that it's scalable to be able to run these sort of super complex workflows that can really drive value. And I think what would be good is sort of at this stage is I think I'm going to sort of turn over to kind of the Boosted Alpha platform. And I want to sort of show, I guess, how we've thought about some of these kind of benefits and some of these problems, and how we sort of think about basically bringing these agents to life and kind of having it fully integrate essentially into your workflows and solve for these issues that we see at like at an enterprise level. What you're sort of looking at on my screen at the moment is kind of like our sort of home dashboard. And each of these different boxes that you're going to see, these are agents that are carrying out a specific task and a specific workflow that we've set up. And they're running that on a repeated basis and on a specific cadence that we can define. So up in the top left here, I've got an agent that's running a kind of like an AI chip market competitor analysis. going out and looking at kind of all of the kind of key players in the chip market, understanding, defining kind of specific sort of analyses or specific criteria, sorry, so in order to judge them by, and then doing an analysis of where each of those sits within that market. I've got an agent here that's looking at kind of like auto tariffs. So with the news overnight, what this is doing is it's actually going and doing a web search. So web search is where we can go and actually like search specific things on Google and give the agent specific topics to be able to go and search when tied to specific stocks. So as the news came in overnight of tariffs around 25% tariffs across kind of like auto parts, this is going out, and for all automobile stocks within the S&P 500 and the Stock 600, it's going to do a web search about for that stock tied to the topic of tariffs and sort of see kind of what's the latest news on that, what are the companies saying, what are some of the things that we need to be aware of if those are stocks that are kind of within our portfolio, within our watch list, or that we closely follow. I've also got one here that's sort of tracking like executive compensation, going into proxy statements for the Dow Jones for those 30 companies. And per stock, breaking down kind of what are the incentives that executives are seeing, and as kind of new proxy statements and things like that come in, notifying me basically if there's changes or there's distinct changes within kind of like compensation structures and executive structures there. So there's kind of lots and lots we can do here. And I think the key thing is kind of around the sort of the customizability element. And I know there's often kind of a lot of conversations about specific use cases. And I guess the way that I would sort of think about it is through prompting and through building out these agents, we can sort of access the data we have available in kind of very specific ways and in the way that kind of perfectly suits essentially your workflow. So I can kind of come to an example here of one of the outputs and kind of how we built it. So this is one that's doing a kind of top and bottom performance analysis for a specific ETF. It's one actually that we kind of help that we kind of build and we actually run sort of the portfolio management for. But we kind of retrieve stocks basically from that ETF. And then we kind of analyze basically the top 5 and the bottom 5 companies in terms of cumulative price return over the last 3 months. Then go out and summarize for each of those companies what are some major stock specific events, some earnings results during this period. And so give me basically this idea of, what is driving performance in my portfolio or in this ETF, and what's some of the reasons for those moves basically in those stocks. And we can see it kind of breaks it down by sort of top 5 stocks by return. And then we kind of get this specific sort of qualitative output, giving kind of sort of the stock specific events and any earnings results that might have driven basically that performance over the last 3 months. And I think this is a good point to almost talk to some of the elements I mentioned earlier in terms of how we're able to do this. How we're able to kind of scale our analysis and kind of how we're able to set up almost like repeatable and consistent workflows that are kind of fully auditable. And to do that, what I kind of want to do is talk to our work log. And as I say, in terms of kind of like auditability, this work log, what it's going to do is it's essentially converting prompts that we've given the system into a set of instructions. Now, those instructions are completely basically transparent. You can come in and see exactly the way that the machine has thought about that workflow. And it provides sort of deep auditability in terms of the steps that the machine is taking in order to carry out your task. We can click into kind of each of these different steps, looking at kind of what is the machine taking to each of the next stage. In order to see, is it actually carrying out this task in the way that I want it to carry out? Now, what we see when we kind of look at this work log is we're seeing a set of kind of instructions laid out as words. What we're actually doing when we write a prompt and then when we build this work log is we're building a set of repeatable code. So what's sat behind this work log is a specific set of code that can be run on any particular cadence to recreate essentially this workflow for you whenever you want that kind of run. Now, that kind of means sort of a few different things, and it kind of leads to a few different things. The first is that element of repeatability we spoke about and kind of consistency. We have a set of steps here that aren't going to change. If I ask this to run on a daily basis, it is a set of code that is repeatable and be run on a daily basis. And it's going to carry out exactly the same sets of steps and get you to a similar type of result, albeit possibly with different data that's kind of factoring in. I think sort of the next element is this idea of kind of like sort of like auditability. So being able to come in and see exactly the steps that have been taken, and knowing that you can come in and sort of change any of these steps as and when you see it. So, for example, if we didn't want to do it for the RTTF and we wanted to do it for the S&P 500, we could come back in, talk to the analyst, and see how that's kind of and make that change so that it's looking at the correct ETF that we wanted to. And I think the sort of the third big element is this idea of scalability. And the reason that we sort of talk to scalability so much is on sort of more kind of on other sort of like single LLM platforms, what you're going to see is if you ask a kind of like simple question or you ask something, for example, what's the weather going to do over the following week? What it's going to go and do is it's going to go out and it's going to read sort of 30 to 40 articles, and it's going to give you a great answer, and it's going to sort of answer that question really strongly. If, however, what you want it to do is go and read, all text basically for companies in the S&P 500, and then kind of like filter down on stocks that are going to be like positively impacted, for example, by improvements in liquid cooling technology, it's still going to carry out almost the same process. So it's still going to go to, 30, 40 articles and try and give you kind of its best sort of approximation of how to kind of carry out that task. What we are offering is the ability to read all of that text. And what that means is we can up basically the complexity of the workflows that we're doing, and we can provide a level of reassurance in the fact that we're not going to be missing data basically as we go through and we carry out these workflows. So as we look into kind of some of these worklogs, we'll see that for this agent, it's found 496 filings, 500 company descriptions, almost 8,000 news developments, almost 500 earnings call summaries, and then 2,500 results using news and web search. And it's combined all of that data into, and it's 15,000, almost 15,800 data sets there that it's kind of looking at. And that is entirely scalable, and it's going to be reading all of those in order to best answer essentially the question that you've posed and the workflow that you've posed. Part of the reason I think that we can do that is we operate in a system where we use like an orchestra of LLMs. So rather than being a sort of single LLM platform, what we are is kind of we use multiple LLMs, and each agent that you're going to go out and build is going to incorporate multiple LLMs into the output of the agent and into the way that it builds out essentially that workflow. So there might be a specific LLM that you're interacting with, for example, in the analyst chat box here. We will then use proprietary technology to turn the prompt into kind of that worklog and into that code. But then at each stage of the worklog, it may be calling on another LLM that's actually best for the task that is required. And we're doing testing in the background to understand basically, what are the LLMs that are out there that are actually best at carrying out each specific task. And that kind of alongside this ability to sort of build out code and a history of having a sort of financial code base means that we can properly scale up and down to the level of the task that we're trying to achieve. I think sort of the final point in terms of almost like the building of the agents is this idea of kind of turning them live and having them monitoring data going forward. We can kind of see as we go into sort of settings and things here, we can start to see how we can set agents to live, and then we can set specific cadences for that to run. This one, for example, is going to run for me weekly at 8 a.m. only on a Monday. And it's then going to go through, and if there's any changes basically to what it's found, or there's anything that you need to be aware of as the person who's running that workflow, it's going to be able to send you an email to say, hey, look, this is something that's happened about your agent. This is something that's happened within this workflow. It's a piece of new information that's come out. We think you need to be aware of it. And we think you need to come in and sort of have a read here and maybe think about some of this information that's kind of come through. So there's this sort of idea of kind of bringing basically bringing the information to you and in the workflows that kind of work for you.
Not to cut you off here, Jamie, but on that one, I think it's really interesting to note the number of tokens being read there. If you go back to the settings, you can see that it's 400 million tokens, which we kind of find analogous to words. So what it's doing here is sort of like giving you that level of sort of superpowers almost, doing more than you can do in an average day. Obviously, this is not within one day, but sort of allowing you to read more, do more. Again, kind of going back to the point you made in the very beginning of like doing more with less. Just want to sort of show the true scale of what this one's doing.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think it does all sort of tie back to that demand for sort of agentic frameworks where we can create these repeatable, scalable, and consistent processes, and almost have these agents start to, carry out the process in the way that you as kind of the user would have done, in a manual sense. But sort of following kind of that workflow through and sort of understanding that this is now going to carry that out in the way that you think about the world and the way that you're kind of like would approach a sort of specific task. And we see this in terms of kind of like the specific use case here. We see this as kind of super useful in terms of being able to filter down on kind of explicit sort of like qualitative instruction and go and read huge amounts of text and then get to kind of quite a concise sort of set of stocks and some reasoning as to why basically they kind of match that exclusive criteria. Another thing that we see and that I've seen kind of quite a lot actually with my clients is and often where they have kind of quite sort of small and concentrated portfolios is, they're going to know their names incredibly well. And people are going to understand the names that they follow very closely, very well. But what we kind of look to do and what has been shown to be super valuable is kind of like, can we go out and then find what are the stocks that are out there that are kind of peers basically to those names? And can we start to track information around those stocks? Can we start to sort of widen the net basically of things we're tracking using this agentic workflow to understand what are my competitors up to and how is that impacting my stock and my stock of interest? This is an example here I've got where I'm looking at companies exclusively in the consumer staples sector of the S&P 500. Now we have there the S&P 500. I sort of want to make it clear we can use exclusive watch lists. We can use different ETFs, and we can use kind of specific portfolios. And I'm going out and I'm finding basically for each of the stocks within that sector, what are the peers? And then I'm going out and I'm reading for all of those peers. I'm going to go and read all of the text around those. And I'm going to sort of see, right, what are some updates basically from those peers that might be impacting market share in this industry? And that can be, that's a relatively sort of general kind of outlook in terms of what we're looking for. We might be looking specifically for things like product updates, who's launching new products, who's launching new strategic initiatives, who has having like changes in management, is there kind of insider buying, are there stock repurchases, all of these sorts of things we can get specific and like focus on when we're building out these agents to really narrow in on kind of what's most important to you. I think the final example, and part of the reason I want to sort of I wanted to show this example, and this is the one I sort of spoke to about kind of like looking at companies in the automobiles industry, for the S&P and for the stock 600, and going out and doing this sort of like a web search. And I want to talk to this technology because it's something that clients are really kind of finding valuable, and it allows us kind of like a deeper an ability to do sort of deeper analysis. We find people are kind of often tracking specific websites, or they're going out and they're doing kind of basically the same Google search across a set of stocks every single day. And it's kind of eating time basically into their morning. So on top of kind of all the data that we sort of have access to within the platform, we wanted to give people the ability to go and actually make searches, pick up information from the web, and sort of integrate workflows that way. So what this agent is doing is it's going out for each stock in the automobiles industry. It's doing a stock web search for each one of those stocks on the topic of tariffs. And it's basically summarizing per stock kind of like the impact and the different things companies are saying about that impact. And this is something where we can sort of see here, we've got web search, it's kind of doing it for all 11 stocks, and we can see that the topic it's kind of running for. So again, we can come into the workload, we can understand kind of exactly the steps it's taken, and then we can start to see basically the output that it's sort of brought in here. And we can do that by looking kind of exclusively at specific URLs and asking sort of track information within there. We can look at almost like investor relations aspects of different websites, all of the public information that's there and that we can kind of go in and ask to track. And we see sort of huge numbers of use cases around that and doing a kind of deeper analysis and working into kind of more integrated workflows in that way as well. I guess the final thing I will call out, and I've sort of spoken about kind of data quite a lot. In terms of what access we sort of have at the moment, we're able to look into kind of like earnings transcripts. We're able to look into sort of specific news. We're able to do web search. We've got SEC filings and CEDA filings. We're in the process of launching like sell side research. And we also have access to a lot, and this kind of goes to almost like the history of the company. We have access to a lot of structured data as well. So we can call within agents, we can call on structured data from CapIQ, St. Louis Fred, S3, ORATS, and providers like that, to be able to sort of add a certain quantitative lens and be able to pull out kind of like what are the numbers, and then start to look at also like all of the qualitative information that goes with it. I think, I guess I kind of want to sort of pause there, I guess, or kind of come back to the presentation and sort of come back. I almost bring it back sort of full circle, I guess, to kind of what the blueprint for sort of success is. And I sort of split this out over kind of four key things. And I think the first thing is to try and understand what you're solving. We want to start small. We want to start basically by focusing on high impact workflows that are going to really drive value at an enterprise level within your teams, and kind of really start to define those. And we work closely with clients to almost understand what their processes are and kind of how we can sort of eke out what those real pain points and those high impact workflows are going to be. We also want to kind of, we need people sort of championing this tech. We need people who are kind of driving it forward. Every company has those people that are sort of very tech forward and willing to sort of try these things out. We want to get them kind of like upskilled and able to sort of to kind of drive adoption throughout the organization. We suggest sort of these kind of like almost incremental rollouts, really focusing basically on customized things within specific teams. But then sharing that knowledge. So, when there's real impactful workflows and impactful processes, we want to make sure that people are aware of that. And we want to make sure that that knowledge is shared basically across teams. And then the final thing, which is just super important, is this idea of providing training and building that internal expertise. There is a learning curve. There is a barrier in terms of understanding kind of how to draw out basically the value from these platforms. And the faster we can get people onto the platforms, learning how to kind of build out agentic frameworks, build out agents, the better kind of a firm is going to be in terms of positioning, sort of upskilling basically its employees, and with the ability to kind of like build, as I say, that kind of like internal expertise and that internal environment of where using kind of generative AI and using these agents is sort of normal and integrated. I think I'm sort of happy to, I guess I've covered, I guess, quite a lot there. And I think it'd probably be great at this point to sort of move to kind of like a sort of Q&A portion, or if there's any questions.
Well, thanks very much for walking through that, Jamie. I think really exciting times for AI. We've all been hearing about it, I guess, now for certainly a number of years, especially folks that have been more excited in the space. But definitely what we're seeing much more institutionally is this expansion from these individual use cases of what we would call, early adopters, these people that are really excited, to now people that are needing to do this across teams. And, calling back that slide that you had on the data, we even saw that in our own survey, right? Younger, high net worth people, folks that are sort of like, I guess, millennials, are both using AI at a more uh, regular clip than the average person and are expecting it from others. So not only are they expecting it from, say, their advisors or people that are working with managing their money, but even in terms of talent retention, I think you're going to start seeing a lot more people sort of demanding that in their workplace as well. So I think a lot of stuff there. And then, just to kind of cover your workflows a little bit that you had shared, which by the way, thank you so much for doing that. I think you can certainly picture those used on an individual basis. But not only that, I think you can start picturing those being expanded out to teams. And to the point that you had made earlier, I think it's about your 2x, 3xing, 4xing the amount of time saved. And it starts becoming like very powerful, almost a logarithmic expansion there. So really, I think exciting stuff. Um, let's jump into some questions here. Actually, I want to flag, check out this QR code if folks want to uh, chat with us more, sort of learn what might be possible for you. Please pull out your phones and use this QR code to book a demo with us and or a chat with us, excuse me. Um, so, the first question here is somebody looking to scale within their team. So I think what they're asking here is like, hey, I'm an individual user. What can I start doing to pass this information that I've now learned onto my larger team? Uh, if you could answer that, Jamie.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I guess the first thing I'd sort of look to is like what are the things is we want to kind of find value, I guess, in terms of like driving adoption. We want to find workflows where there's things that are going to be valuable for those people. So I guess my advice on that front would be what are the high impact workflows, even if it's simple things where we can sort of demonstrate value to the rest of the team and sort of show that like it's something that can become sort of fully integrated. Try and sort of drive that understanding of almost like what agentic AI is, the capabilities of it, but starting with sort of like a couple of relatively simple sort of high impact workflows that really just save people time. I think people in a lot of ways, and I sort of see this, there's kind of a resistance until you've done something that's sort of explicitly valuable. And people are rightly skeptical. They're right to sort of come in and sort of think, I'm not sure this can work for me, and I do things in my own way. So the best way I would say is, as I say, focusing on those high impact workflows. They're going to really drive kind of like time savings basically in what they're doing, and then sort of sharing that knowledge across.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's great advice. The next sort of question here is what is the best? It's kind of, I think, aligned with the question that you just answered, but what is the best first steps for smaller firms to take? I think we're talking a lot about large institutions and how they are looking to implement this stuff, but not everybody is, a multi-billion dollar fund. So what would you say smaller firms can do to take advantage of AI, but in an enterprise way for their teams?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think in terms of almost like where to start, and you're probably going to get tired of the phrase high impact workflows, but I think in terms of like where to start, I think the key thing is to start. So start having a think about processes that you're doing a lot, things that are kind of like maybe you've been doing them, it might be 10, 20 years, it might be stuff that kind of is just sort of second nature to you, but actually doesn't drive kind of huge sort of value to the bottom line in terms of where you can be sort of spending your time. So I think for me, it's sort of like I would sort of advise kind of start testing different tools out, start seeing kind of what's working for you. If you have an idea and you realize you're doing something and you think could a sort of generative AI platform do this? Is there an agentic workflow out there that could do this? then ask that question and go and sort of, I suppose, find out basically by testing those platforms out. I know our teams here are always happy to kind of receive questions of sort of like, can you do this basically? And is this possible? And whenever we're sort of talking to our clients in those kind of initial calls, it's like you're going to sort of be testing things out. You're going to sort of realize as you're sat in sort of certain on certain days that there's things where you're wondering whether basically the platform could do it. Just ask the question, and we'll go. Basically, the answer is often yes, and the answer is often yes. We can go and do that. And so I think it's just sort of trying to think about where it can fit in and sort of testing it out.
For sure. Um, I guess I'd be remiss in not asking this next one. Every webinar we do, every, piece of content we put out, the standard question is, what are the use cases? How are people using it? How are people that look like me using it? I think you've certainly covered this in a pretty robust way on the call, but I wanted to maybe like invert how we're thinking uh, about it. I think you had sort of covered it more from an enterprise perspective, but if you're thinking about maybe different persona types, different styles of how people within investment are using this technology, you maybe just give one, two use cases for sort of like buy side, sell side, and wealth managers that you're actively seeing people are having success with now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, and I can talk to this, I guess, I'll talk to it from a sort of individual level, and then I can also talk to, I guess, somewhat of the kind of the firm-wide distribution of kind of output through almost like API capability as well.
Mm.
And I think we bucket almost use cases into sort of three key areas. And those are across kind of like automating, we call it sort of like automating drudgery, but automating some of those sort of key pain points, be that almost like, and the way we think about that is kind of like, you've got to create sort of like an investment thesis that covers exactly the same sort of structure each time for a stock as you're going into like sort of like an investment committee meeting. Sort of like report and commentary writing. We see a lot of clients who come in and they basically have to generate these reports and they have to write these reports where they're going to similar data sets each time. They're manually having to go out and then write these out. And we're seeing a lot of people kind of automate all the different sections of that and then run those basically on specific cadences. I think a big one as well is sort of answering, especially in kind of the wealth space, is kind of like answering a lot of like client queries. When queries come in, basically about sort of specific stocks and specific information, it's kind of being able to very quickly get up to speed on sort of certain areas of interest, certain stocks, and being able to very quickly go back to clients and say, look, these are the reasons why, and sort of answer those. And that's kind of like automating away, as I say, sort of that kind of like some of those pain points. I think the second bit sort of talks to kind of like the monitoring use case. Be that sort of portfolio monitoring or kind of watch list monitoring and monitoring sort of all the data that's around that, what stocks are driving performance and why, tracking macro indicators that are affecting my portfolio, tracking kind of like the thematic exposures of my portfolio. Tariffs is kind of it's sort of the big news point at the moment. It's like, how exposed am I? And is that changing as I add certain names or as companies kind of release explicit information? I think we also see on that case in kind of the monitoring cases, people, especially on and kind of like more sort of bigger sort of institutional firms, they kind of people like tracking assumptions, I guess, in things like financial models that they're building. So they have a set of assumptions that they're using basically when they build out their models, and they can kind of come in and see, let's go and read kind of all the information kind of around those assumptions, and let's see if there's anything that's coming out that's going to impact those. And then there's sort of other, I guess, more kind of more simple ones in terms of the I've sort of talked to like the exec compensation tracking, risk disclosure tracking in filings, key sort of KPI extraction and tracking as well. And then I think the third sort of section I would talk to, and then we sort of call it superpowers, but and I think really what we're talking to is like things that generally just aren't really possible without having a piece of technology go out and do the reading for you and sort of do that level of analysis. We showed when I was kind of running through the around kind of like liquid cooling sort of thematic, like filtering down to stocks that are going to be positively impacted by liquid cooling technology. that's something that requires going out. And if we did it on the S&P 500, that could be done the Russell 1000, Russell 3000. And to be able to go out and read all of that text, all of that information is just not really feasible, basically, in order to kind of derive who are the stocks that are going to be most impacted and they're going to benefit from that. So it kind of talks to sort of this ability to go out and do analysis that wasn't before possible, on top of kind of like, what are the monitoring use cases? What are the pain points I have that I kind of just want to automate away? And I think a lot of that talks to almost like the sort of investment advisor side, especially around kind of commentary and report writing into the asset management side, and sort of the buy side in general. I think you mentioned sell side there, Fraser. I think that's really where almost like this web search capability comes into play, and being able to go and do sort of deep analysis on like specific areas of companies, monitor explicit websites that you're interested in looking at, and kind of any changes that are sort of within there, and sort of do that kind of deeper level. We see clients looking at sort of average prices of products, kind of over time, or we see clients looking at almost like the career sites of websites and seeing kind of like, right, what's changing here in terms of like job postings? Does that give an indication of like some sort of indication of kind of how the company is doing? So the sort of, I guess the annoying, I've sort of spitballed there a lot of different examples. I guess the kind of annoying answer to this question is, there's a huge amount of data. We can basically customize how we see that data in sort of any number of different ways and in a totally customizable way. And the use cases that are possible are really defined by the processes that people are interested in kind of automating and looking at.
Yeah, you could maybe think of it as thinking about a problem that you would like to solve, whether you're buy side, whether you're sell side, whether you're in wealth management. I'm sure there's all of those folks that have things that they don't necessarily love doing on a day-to-day basis, weekly basis, a monthly basis, quarterly basis. And thinking about ways to do that. I know certainly other folks are certainly worried about missing things. So I think that's where that monitoring piece comes in, making sure that you're always on top of the stuff that matters to your universe. And then a kind of fun sci-fi version of that sort of superpowers, new capabilities is the sort of exciting thing about AI is kind of the sky's the limit, right? And so there's a lot of stuff that is yet to happen as well, and more and more things will be done. I see that it's almost right at 1 o'clock, so I think we'll end it there. I really want to thank everybody for joining us. It's always a delight to share what we've learned and what we're seeing on the streets. And I certainly want to thank Jamie for leading us through this webinar today. So thank you so much, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and I hope that's been useful.
Of course. Thank you so much, everybody. You all have a great afternoon.